Hello everyone, my name is Isaac Sprong, and I'm going to talk today about science assessment in middle school, next generation science standards, and the Common Core state standards. Bear with me as I've never put a narration onto a slideshow before, but I'm kind of excited actually to have another tool in my toolbox in terms of being able to do this and posting things online for my students to look at. Because they always appreciate having lectures and things online, and if it's really easy as it seems to be, then I think it's something that I could do relatively easily. So thank you for having us do this. It's definitely different. Thank you. Alright. So basically I wanted to start with this question, of course, since that was the assignment, but I've been interested in how the next generation science standards and the Common Core state standards can be turned into assessments. Of course that means a whole unit plan, because you can't just have an assessment in a box, and you can't just have a unit plan without an assessment. The two are so inextricably linked from each other. But also linked is this concept that next generation science standards and Common Core state standards are here for all science teachers, and yet so we have these kind of dual standards that we're having to deal with, but they're very, very linked to each other, and yet not quite the same as each other. And then, I mean, that's not even throwing in if you teach IB like I do, or if you also have the college readiness standards and things like that. But looking at this whole picture, I was just starting to turn this muddle in my head. So I was like, what would it look like if we needed to turn it into an assessment? What would it look like if we had these standards, we need to look at both standards, and we wanted to turn it into a assessment and unit? So that's what I did. Of course, looking at the standards, the science and the math are of course inextricably linked. You can't have science class without doing math, because there is no science without math, really. So looking at them, there's this huge list, this isn't even all of them, of all of the different things that you would need to cover. It's very, very daunting, and I've almost come to realize that you need to have this in the back of your head while you're looking at what units you want to cover and what types of things you want to cover, and kind of go back and always have the skills there. It's not really possible to look at the Common Core standards and strictly design a unit, because they're all skills. So because they're all skills, you could really link them to any topic you could possibly think of. So you can pretty much drive yourself insane as you sit and look at all of these standards and say, now what could I put together based on this unit? You really need to kind of take them and kind of back burner them in your mind while you contemplate, what the heck am I going to cover this year? What can I cover? What will be a logical order for me to cover things in? On the other hand, the next generation science standards are a kind of a combo of content and skills at the same time. So if you look at this one in particular, develop a model to describe the cycling of water through Earth's systems driven by energy from the sun and the force of gravity, it'd be a great way to look at a watershed activity, right? It's basically saying, you have to not just understand what a watershed is, understand how water flows and the water cycle and all of that stuff, but instead actually developing a model of what's happening inside of a watershed. So it's taking that math and that science, you have to put the two of them together. That's what real science is. So it really helps it to take it out of this world of just skills and ideas, and you could go any direction with it, and takes it and makes it a skill and an idea together, which to me makes it so much more concrete and much more easy to obtain in terms of unit planning. So let's look at what I put together for a unit. Oh, also throw this in here. You can't hit every standard all the time. And like I said, you have to do math and science together. The best units, I think, are going to be units that tie English and science together, math and science together, that have art standards, that have every standard you can possibly think of tied together, so you get that multidisciplinary approach. The easiest one, of course, is math with science, but I really appreciate taking other disciplines that are in most students' minds less related to science, and also bringing them in terms of a science unit. I did not do that this time just because of the time constraints of everything that was involved, but I did want to bring that up, that there's no way you're going to be able to hit every standard for one unit, because that would drive you and your students quite insane. There's also no way that you could have a good unit that only uses one discipline's standards. It's not a solid unit if you're only taking the science standards and only covering the science standard stuff, because it would be so one-dimensional then that I don't think it would feel real to any of your students. So what I found online, I can't deny, and took and looked at was a watershed unit assessment. It was a very interesting task from the NSTA website, and it's very interesting because it really does take this modeling concept of math and the science concept of the water cycle and a watershed and puts them together in terms of assessing a student, which is fantastic. It hits all of those standards, which is really interesting in terms of how much content the students are actually learning and how many skills the students are learning. I think it's one of those units that the students wouldn't even realize just how much they've learned in this one unit, because to them they're learning about a watershed. So hey, yeah, it's interesting, we've got this watershed activity and we're going to go outside and we're going to learn about the water cycle and we're going to do all of that, and then we're going to take a brief moment to learn some geometry, and they're all going to stop and go, wait, geometry? What does geometry have to do with science? Well, we don't live in a single one-dimensional world that we never go outside of our own discipline. Science incorporates everything. So I think that's going to be very fun for the students, and what it comes down to is they're being tasked with this idea of a watershed, what goes into a watershed, what comes out of a watershed, and how can they look at that in a scientific and mathematical modeling terms. So through this, we're going to look at the skills that they need. Of course, the idea is we start with the skills, you go to the assessment, or you start with the skills and the assessments, and then you go into the unit plan. So I'm doing a backwards design, of course, because that's the only way to really plan a unit. Also, I argue that the backwards design concept is not in fact backwards. Having come from research and development, there is no such thing as backwards design. You always start with a goal in mind and then figure out how you're going to reach that goal. So there's absolutely nothing backwards about backwards design, other than for a long time teachers were doing things backwards. So really what we have is design, and what teachers were doing was backwards design. So just a little pet peeve on my part, having come from the research and development field for a long time. So basically I just want to take a look at the skills that they were going to look at. Of course, if I'm going to have them look at a watershed, they need to read a map. They need to be able to find out how much water is getting in there. In order to find out how much water is getting in there, you have to look at precipitation. And if you look at precipitation, you have to know the size of the watershed. So it's not going to be a uniform shape. They're going to have to figure out how to find the area of a watershed that has all of these crazy angles and stuff like that. They're going to, of course, be daunted by that at first. So there's going to have a geometry lesson and how to look at non-uniform shapes and taking their area. And then, of course, in science, there's no better way to look at all of this data than through creating graphs. So we'll be creating graphs, and of course when you create a graph, you have to interpret a graph. And then when you interpret a graph, you're doing this inference, right? So they're going to have to look at the ideas of where is all of this data leading us in terms of ideas, and how is it all coming together. Some ideas I came up with in terms of unit design and particular lessons is to get the kids outside and explore a portion of the watershed, to get them outside and even look at the watershed of the school. Like, where does all of the water hit? It hits the roof. Where does it go from there? Where does it go after it hits the roof? Where is it? It's running off to somewhere. Where is it going to? Talk to the engineer. Talk to the maintenance crew and say, hey, all this water that's hitting around here, where on earth does it all end up? How do you control all of that, and where is it going in terms of our impact on the world around us? Of course, you have to go through the water cycle. A great way to do that is through a jigsaw, where everybody gets a portion of the water cycle. Somebody gets precipitation, somebody gets evapotranspiration, somebody gets evaporation just by itself, all of that good stuff, and then you bring it all together, and because it really is like a puzzle, it actually works really well, because it's not just a jigsaw in terms of a concept kind of a jigsaw, which I hate. Students really have a hard time seeing the big picture then, but with this, it's such a concrete type of jigsaw that it really could be a puzzle. I mean, you could hand them an empty water cycle. Everybody has their own little piece, and they have to put their piece into the water cycle and explain it to the students around them. So it would literally be a physical jigsaw puzzle at that point in time, which I think would make it a much more easily attained, especially for a middle school student. Most of even my high school students that I teach now, when I do a jigsaw with them, it fails miserably because they can't see that overall picture. But it's much easier done with something concrete and simple like the water cycle. And then I'd really like to have students assess their impact on the water cycle. Where is the water that they're using going? How much water are they using? It's really important in terms of watershed analysis and the water cycle for everyone to know exactly where their water is going, so that they can put their particular footprint into the larger picture. There's no way that I think our students realize exactly how much water they use and exactly where it's going. So I think it would be very impactful on them in terms of their real life, which makes the whole unit, of course, that much more impactful for them. So they feel like they're connected to it because they realize that it is really part of their everyday life. Along with that, in order to really interpret a map, I think one of the best ways to do it is to create a map. So have them make a map of the school, have them take all of the area of starting with just the school room that they're in, and make a map of it. They of course say, oh, we'll just draw a picture of it. Yeah, but how high is that desk in relation to the floor underneath it? How high is the chalkboard in relation to the floor underneath it? So they can get an idea of, oh, that's what all those lines mean on a topographical map. It's not that the ground is covered in lines. It's that every time I go up or down, I have a line, and the faster I go up, the closer those lines are together. So I think that would make it a great way for them to see and make a topographical map, starting in just the room. They can make one of their bedrooms, make one of their house, make one of their block, something like that, so they can get an idea of how it all goes together, so that when they go and look at another topographical map, it's much more intuitive for them in terms of how this map actually works. And then of course there's calculating the area of odd objects, because a watershed, like the one in the previous slide, is going to be a crazy oblong shape with narrow parts and thick parts and things like that, but which is going to seem very daunting to them at first, until they realize that all they really need to do is cut it up into pieces. And once you cut it up into pieces, you get triangles and squares, and you can really estimate fairly accurately then, just on paper, just how it all works and how it all fits together, as long as you can cut out, like in this picture here, figure 1, figure 2, and figure 3, and figure those 3 out independently of each other. So we'll be doing a lot of that as well. So I'd just like to thank you. It has been a great class, and we've had some great insights and some great discussions on all of those boards. I hope you enjoyed the unit that I put together. It was fun to sit and get some ideas in terms of a watershed activity and how it all comes back to the next generation science standards. As you can see, the unit that ends up coming together ends up being much more complex when you do take into account all of those science standards, because you're trying to look at all of the math and all of the science that goes into the entire unit. And at the same time, it's taking that constructivist scaffolding approach where I assume that they don't know how to do a lot of the things that are in there. Of course, I would start with a pre-assessment so I can figure out exactly what they do know how to do. But in 7th and 8th grade, or 6th grade even, you wouldn't have the students able to do a lot of the more complex modeling or math and making graphs and things like that. It's relatively new to them at that point in time in terms of interpreting it, and especially having 2 sets of data on the same graph. So that would be a fun advancement for them, really setting them up for high success in high school. So again, thank you. It has been a lot of fun taking this class, and I appreciate all of what we've conversed about online. It is always a little interesting and awkward, but fun nonetheless. I hope you appreciated this PowerPoint presentation, and I will bring up the reference slide for a moment simply because, as I'm going to record this as a video, I want you to be able to see where I got all of this stuff from. Thank you again so much. Here's the references, of course. Just take a quick glance at that if you want to. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. If you're really interested in it, hit the pause button and take a look. Alright, thank you much, and it's been a very fun class with everyone.